there are no special problems involved with filming a literary classic. My first 6 or 7 films were all based on other people's works, and well-known works actually. The trilogy was there, then there was Tara Shankar Banerjee's Jalsa Ghar, then The Music Room, then the Philosopher's Stone, Parash Pathar made from the story by Parashuram, and then Tagore, the Teen Kanya stories, 3 daughters stories came. You see, first one has to consider what attracts one to a particular story. Whether it's a classic or an unknown piece of work, it doesn't matter. There are certain elements which obviously draw one to the work in the first place. And the director tries to preserve those elements and modify the rest of it or embellish it with inventions of his own, which I have done in every case. I think there are considerable departures in the trilogy. For instance, the original book, the 2 volumes, have something like 300, 400 characters, whereas in the film you encounter only 30 or 40. So characters were dropped, incidents were dropped, they were shuffled around. Sometimes you will find a story which is almost written for the screen. Therefore, there isn't very much modification needed, but at all times one has to recast the story in terms of the cinema, while preserving the spirit or certain major characters, certain major incidents which people remember from the reading of the original work. And that has to be done. But then, after a point, while working on the script, you just forget the original story or don't look at it again. You have already absorbed it into your system. And what emerges is a combination of you and the original. And that is always what is needed. Well, I never called myself a humanist. I think it's the critics who have given this, that's how they have categorized me, but I have nothing against it, provided it is meant to suggest that I'm interested in human beings and interested in the relationship between human beings. That is something which deeply concerns me, and it has concerned me right from the beginning. I think some of it has come from the reading of literature, Bengali literature. It certainly is an aspect of Vibhuti Bhushan, very much. But again, an individual, after all, belongs to a certain social class, and he carries with him the problems of his class. And when you show a human being in a film, you obviously cannot show him in isolation from his problems, his background, his surroundings, the particular class to which he belongs. And when you bring in other characters, obviously you bring in certain conflicts. And I don't think that it is quite true to say that I stay away from problems or solutions to problems. Certainly there is one thing discernible in my films which every perceptive viewer will notice is a moral attitude. Even in the trilogy you find that the conclusion of the trilogy is very definitely for man taking responsibility. That is the conclusion of the film, rather than stay away from responsibility. And even in some of my early films, like, for instance, The Big City, Mahanagar, you find this woman, this housewife, who has to go out and take a job. And obviously there are lots of people who are against the idea of an ordinary middle-class woman going out and taking the job of a saleswoman. But my attitude is very clear in the film. Even toward the end, you will see that it definitely suggests that it is a good thing, it's a proper thing in the circumstances for a woman to be doing a job. I really am not very sure of what is meant by a political film. The definition is not very clear to me. If the element of politics comes into it, for instance, as in Shimabodho, you have the suggestion of Naxalite disturbances in the background, that bombs are heard and crackers are heard. That's there. And in Ashani Shanket, you have the whole business of the war, which is supposed to be taking place in the background. That obviously gives it a political color, because after all, the famine itself, the 1943 famine, was caused indirectly by the war, because the food was being diverted to the troops. So in that sense, they can be called political films, but I don't see why they should be called political films, except that they are films where there is an element of politics in it, in some form or the other. Like, for instance, in Shatranj Ke Khiladi, that's very much a political film, because it deals with a political event. And that much of politics is certainly can be granted, or whenever necessary, such politics has there to be included in the film. There's nothing one can do about it. In fact, it is necessary occasionally to deal with films, particularly when you're dealing with contemporary subjects. Politics is so very much in the air that you can hardly leave out politics. Either directly or indirectly, obliquely, the element of politics has to come into the film. But violence, just talking of violence, I'm actually much more interested in psychological violence than physical violence. There are two aspects of violence, actually. In fact, for instance, in my very first film, Pathapanchali, I can mention two scenes. One of intense psychological violence, where Durga's mother, Shaubaja, is so cruel by implication to the old woman, where she doesn't even offer her food while she herself is eating. And she wants shelter, wants to come back to her own little cottage, but she doesn't let her do so. And she walks away to her death. That is, I think, is intensely violent, that scene, suppressed. Again, in Pathapanchali, you have the scene of real physical violence, where the mother drags her daughter by the hair and throws her out of the house. You see, that kind of violence is perfectly valid, I think. It was there also in the original. But the other kind of violence, the physical violence, which is so very much in evidence in the cinema of the world today, if I come across a story which contains such violence, and which convincingly and interestingly and dramatically, I would certainly not mind using. I've nothing against using violence. I once had the idea of doing a segment of Mahabharata into a film. Now that, of course, would have contained a great deal of violence. I would have loved to have done that. I think it is adequate for an artist to present certain social problems and suggest the kind of attitude that he's taking to the problem without suggesting a solution, because he may not always have the solution ready. It is, I think, enough if he's able to make people aware of the problems, to make people think about the problems. And of course the ultimate answer is implicit. It calls for a change. It calls for maybe a revolution. Actually, my family has been closely involved in children's literature for a very long time. My grandfather was a pioneer, and he founded a magazine called Sandesh way back in long before I was born, actually 8 or 10 years before I was born. Then after his death, my father took over, and he died in 1923, and soon after his death, I think 2 or 3 years after his death, the magazine folded up. In 1960, we just, on a Sunday, I think, we sat chatting about this and that, and I had a poet friend of mine, Subhash Mukherjee, who casually suggested that why don't we revive this magazine. It immediately struck me as a very interesting idea. And we, on the spot, we decided to revive Sandesh. This was 1961. And so the magazine came out again. I was joint editor with Subhash Mukherjee. And it was then, at the age of 40, that I decided to write for Sandesh. First of all, I started by translating poems by Edward Lear, limericks by Lewis Carroll, and then plots began to come to me, story plots, and I started writing stories. Of course, I had read a great deal of children's literature when I was a boy, and certain kinds of literature appealed to me greatly. I was a great admirer of Jules